My brother threw a lavish engagement party in the penthouse I bought him, but wiped my name from the guest list. As the guests arrived, a legal officer handed him an eviction notice. When his fiancée read the real owner's name, the room went dead silent. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and, until recently, I would have told you my family was complicated but normal. Not perfect. Not especially close. Just normal. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The whole story started with a phone call. I was at work finishing a client report when my phone lit up with my cousin Emily's name. "Hey, Emily." "Claire, quick question," she said. "What are you wearing to Lucas's engagement party?" I laughed. "What engagement party?" There was a pause. "The engagement party. Lucas and Victoria's." I sat back in my chair. I knew my brother was planning to propose. That wasn't news. The party was. "I haven't heard anything about it." "Oh." Just one word. But it immediately changed the conversation. It sounded less like surprise and more like someone realizing they shouldn't have said something. "Maybe invitations haven't gone out yet," Emily said. Maybe. Neither of us sounded convinced. After we hung up, I tried focusing on work. It didn't happen. I kept thinking about the conversation. Lucas and I weren't distant relatives who talked twice a year. He was my younger brother. Why would other people know about the party before I did? The question stayed with me longer than it should have. Maybe because deep down, it reminded me of something I'd spent years ignoring. I was 15 when my mother died. Lucas was 13. My dad tried his best after that. I truly believe he did. But most of his attention went to Lucas. Everyone worried about Lucas. Teachers checked on him. Relatives checked on him. Neighbors checked on him. And honestly, I worried about him too. He was my little brother. What I didn't notice back then was how quickly people assumed I'd be fine. I became the responsible one, the independent one, the strong one. At first, that felt like a compliment. Later, it became a job description. When I got my first part-time job, people praised my maturity. When Lucas struggled, people rushed to help. When I worked weekends to pay for things I needed, everyone said they were proud of me. When Lucas had a rough week, everyone focused on making him feel better. Nobody was trying to be cruel. That's what made it easy to overlook. The difference was always small. 100 little moments instead of one big one. Over time, I got used to solving my own problems. If something broke, I handled it. If money was tight, I worked more. If life got difficult, I figured it out. Meanwhile, Lucas was always seen as someone who needed a little extra support. Eventually, I stopped questioning it. That was simply how our family worked. Or at least, I thought it was. A few days after Emily's call, the engagement party kept coming up. A relative mentioned travel plans. An aunt talked about booking a hotel. Someone asked if I was helping organize the event. Every conversation left me more confused. How did everyone seem to know about this party except me? One evening, I opened the family group chat. I normally kept it muted because there were too many notifications. This time, I started scrolling. Photos, travel discussions, restaurant recommendations, people coordinating flights. The engagement party was clearly happening. And it had been discussed for weeks. Then I found a message from one of my uncles. He joked that Lucas might need extra parking because so many guests were coming. Another relative replied, "Almost 100 people. This is going to be huge." I stopped scrolling. Almost 100 guests. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Because when a party is big enough for 100 people, forgetting to invite the groom's own sister isn't a simple mistake. I wish I could tell you that realizing I wasn't invited immediately made me angry. It didn't. The truth is, My first reaction was to make excuses for everyone. That had become a habit. A very old one. For most of my life, whenever something felt unfair, I found a reason that made it easier to accept. Maybe that's why it took me so long to see the bigger picture. Back in college, I was too busy trying to build a future to spend much time comparing what I had to what Lucas had. I attended a state university about 2 hours from home. Nothing fancy. I worked almost the entire time I was there. Some semesters I had one job. Some semesters I had two. There were mornings when I attended classes half awake because I'd closed a restaurant the night before. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. I paid my bills. I graduated. And for the first time, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me. Lucas had a different experience. Dad helped with most of his tuition. Relatives occasionally pitched in when he needed extra money. Whenever Lucas ran into trouble, someone stepped forward. At the time, I didn't resent it. Honestly, I was too focused on my own goals. And despite everything, Lucas and I got along pretty well. He wasn't a bad brother. That's important. A lot of people hear stories like this and imagine someone openly selfish from the beginning. That wasn't Lucas. At least not then. He was funny, easygoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make friends within 10 minutes. If I was the planner, he was the charmer. We balanced each other out. I remember one Thanksgiving when we were both in our 20s. I was helping Dad in the kitchen while Lucas entertained half the family in the living room. My aunt laughed and pointed toward him. "That boy could sell ice to a snowman." Dad smiled. "He gets that from me." A few minutes later, my aunt turned to me. "And Claire gets all the responsibility." Everyone laughed, including me. At the time, it felt harmless. Looking back, it was surprisingly accurate. After college, I started working in cybersecurity. Most people didn't know much about the field back then. Whenever relatives asked what I did, I usually got blank stares. "So, computers?" "Basically." That answer seemed to satisfy everyone. The work was demanding, but I loved it. For the first time, effort produced results. The harder I worked, the more opportunities appeared. A few years later, I left my corporate job and started my own consulting company. It was terrifying. For months, I wondered if I had made a huge mistake. Then the contracts started coming in. One client became 3. 3 became 8. Before long, I was making more money than I ever thought possible. The funny part? My family didn't seem especially interested in how I got there. They mostly cared about what my success might mean for Lucas. One Sunday afternoon, Dad called. "Your brother's thinking about starting something new." I laughed. "That's a dangerous sentence." Dad laughed too. "I'm serious." "What kind of business?" "He wants to open an online sporting goods store." "Does he have experience running one?" There was a pause. "Not exactly." That should have answered my question. A few months later, Lucas launched the business anyway. To be fair, he was excited. I remember him calling me late one evening. "Claire, this is it." "This is it?" "My future." I laughed. "No pressure? Just wait. You'll see." And honestly, I wanted him to succeed. I really did. For a while, things looked promising. He posted updates constantly, talked about growth plans, showed off inventory. Every family gathering somehow turned into a presentation about his business. Dad loved it. Relatives loved it. Lucas loved it. I was happy for him. Then the updates became less frequent. The excited phone calls stopped. Family conversations shifted to other topics. Nobody said anything directly. But I noticed. One evening, I texted him, "How's the business going?" A few hours later, he replied, "Could be better." That wasn't like him. Lucas usually sounded optimistic even when things were bad. A week later, I called. He didn't answer. Another week passed. Still nothing. Then one Friday evening, while I was finishing work, my phone started ringing. Lucas. I answered immediately, "Hey." For a second, he didn't say anything. That alone told me something was wrong. Finally, he exhaled. "Claire." His voice sounded different. Not embarrassed. Not exactly. More like someone trying to figure out how to ask a question he didn't want to ask. I leaned back in my chair. "What's going on?" There was another pause. Then he said 4 words that instantly changed the tone of the conversation. "I need your help." For a moment, neither of us said anything. I swiveled my chair away from my computer and looked out the office window. "How bad is it?" I asked. Lucas let out a nervous laugh. That wasn't a good sign. "Pretty bad." He explained that sales had slowed down for months. A supplier issue had delayed inventory. A few customers demanded refunds. Then some bills started piling up. The business wasn't completely dead, but it was close. "What do you need?" I asked. Another pause. "Money." At least he was honest. I rubbed my forehead. "How much?" When he told me the number, I nearly dropped my phone. It wasn't a small amount. Not life-changing money for me at that point, but definitely enough to make me stop and think. "Lucas, I know." His voice got quieter. "I know it's a lot." I could hear how embarrassed he was. For once, he wasn't trying to charm his way through the conversation. He sounded defeated. That made the decision harder. If he'd been arrogant, I probably would have said no immediately. Instead, he sounded like my little brother. The same kid who used to follow me around the house asking 100 questions a day. The same kid who sat next to me at our mother's funeral because neither of us knew what to say. "I'll think about it," I finally said. "That's fair." He didn't argue. He didn't pressure me. That surprised me. A couple days later, I met him for coffee. He looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. The confident guy who usually walked into every room like he owned it seemed smaller somehow. We talked for nearly an hour. About the business. About mistakes he'd made. About things he wished he'd done differently. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to a version of Lucas who wasn't performing for anyone, just being honest. Before we left, he looked at me and said something I hadn't heard from him in a long time. "Even if you can't help, thanks for listening." That stuck with me. A week later, I transferred the money. Not enough to erase every problem, but enough to help him pay off the most urgent debts and close things down without destroying his finances. He called me less than 10 minutes after receiving it. "Claire." His voice cracked slightly. "You didn't have to do this." "Probably not." "I mean it." "I know." "No, seriously." He laughed nervously. "I'll pay you back." I smiled. "We'll talk about that later." For the first time in months, he sounded relieved. And honestly, I felt relieved too. A few weeks later, the business officially closed. Nobody celebrated. Nobody pretended it had been a success. But Lucas handled it better than I expected. Instead of blaming everyone else, he took responsibility. At least publicly. Family members started talking about how mature he was being. My father called one evening. "I heard what you did." I knew exactly what he meant. "Lucas told you?" "He did." Dad was quiet for a second. "I'm proud of you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because hearing those words from him was surprisingly rare. "Thanks. You saved your brother from a very difficult situation." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but I carried it around for days. Maybe because I wanted to believe things were changing. At family gatherings, the mood felt lighter. Lucas seemed more relaxed. We joked with each other again, argued about sports, made fun of old family stories, normal sibling stuff. For a while, it genuinely felt like we were rebuilding something. One Saturday, we spent nearly 3 hours helping Dad clean out part of the garage. Lucas showed up early, brought coffee, actually stayed until the work was finished. Dad noticed too. "You've grown up," he told him. Lucas grinned. "Took me long enough." Everyone laughed, including me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the responsible sibling carrying everything alone. I felt like I had a brother again. Months passed. Life settled down. My business kept growing. I hired new employees, signed larger contracts. Most days were busy enough that family drama barely crossed my mind. Then one evening, while I was leaving a client meeting, my phone rang. Lucas. I answered immediately. "Hey." He didn't sound excited, or relaxed, or relieved. He sounded tired, the kind of tired that comes from hearing bad news. "You got a minute?" he asked. "Sure." I unlocked my car and tossed my bag into the passenger seat. "What's up?" He exhaled heavily. Then he said something I hadn't expected to hear again. "I lost my job." I sat quietly for a second. "What happened?" "Layoffs." His answer came out flat. The company had cut multiple positions, and Lucas was one of them. For once, it wasn't because of a bad decision or some risky idea. It was just bad luck. Over the following months, finding work became his full-time job. Some weeks he sounded optimistic. Other weeks, he didn't. "I've got an interview Friday." Or, "They went with another candidate." I tried to help where I could. I reviewed his resume, connected him with people I knew, and occasionally covered lunch when we met. Nothing unusual, just normal family support. Still, I noticed something familiar. Whenever Lucas struggled, everyone seemed to look in my direction. Dad would call. "Your brother's having a rough time." Or, "Keep checking in on him." As if I wasn't already doing exactly that. One Sunday, Lucas invited me to lunch. I expected another conversation about job applications. Instead, he spent half the meal talking about someone named Victoria. At first, I thought she was helping him network. Then I noticed the smile he couldn't hide. "Okay," I said. "Who's Victoria?" His grin widened immediately. "She's my girlfriend." I laughed. "Since when?" "A few months." That surprised me. Lucas usually announced relationships almost immediately. He shrugged. "I wanted to make sure this one was serious." That was probably the first time I'd ever heard him say that. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's name came up constantly. A restaurant she liked, a movie she'd recommended, a project she was working on. Even Dad noticed. One evening, he called and said, "I think your brother's finally growing up." I wasn't sure I'd go that far, but something definitely felt different. Then Lucas invited me to meet her. The three of us had dinner at a casual restaurant downtown. Victoria made a strong first impression without seeming like she was trying to. She was confident but easygoing, professional without being stiff. When we sat down, she smiled and said, "It's nice to finally meet you." "You too." "I feel like I already know you." "Oh?" "Lucas talks about you all the time." I immediately looked at my brother. He suddenly became fascinated by the menu. That made all of us laugh. The conversation flowed naturally after that. Victoria worked in operations for a regional company. She was organized, practical, and thoughtful. The more she talked, the more I understood why Lucas liked her, and honestly, why he needed her. She balanced him. Where Lucas chased ideas, Victoria thought through consequences. Where Lucas improvised, Victoria planned. At one point, he stepped away to answer a call. Victoria lowered her voice slightly. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure." "He really looks up to you." I blinked. "Lucas told you that?" "Not directly." She smiled. "But it's obvious." For some reason, hearing that affected me more than I expected. Growing up, Lucas and I had our differences. Still, beneath everything else, we were family. As the months passed, I spent more time around both of them. The relationship seemed healthy, stable. For the first time in years, I found myself imagining a future where Lucas finally had things figured out. One evening, all four of us had dinner together: Dad, Lucas, Victoria, and me. Halfway through the meal, Lucas realized he'd forgotten his wallet. Again. Victoria rolled her eyes. "Good thing you're charming." Dad laughed. Then he pointed toward her. "You're exactly what he needs." Victoria laughed too. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It absolutely is." I found myself agreeing, because she brought out a version of Lucas that seemed more responsible than the one I'd known for years. A few weeks later, I was finishing paperwork at my office when my phone rang. "Dad." I answered. "Hey." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Claire, I need to ask you something." I leaned back in my chair. "What is it?" There was a brief pause. "It's about Lucas and Victoria." Then he mentioned a number. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to make sure I'd heard him correctly, because it was the biggest favor my family had ever asked of me. I sat in my office while Dad explained what was going on. "Lucas is serious about Victoria, Claire." "I know. He's planning to propose." That part wasn't surprising. Anyone who spent time around them could see where the relationship was heading. "What exactly are you asking for?" Dad hesitated. That was never a good sign. "Lucas needs a place." A place? A real place. There it was. The real reason for the call. Dad explained that Victoria came from a respected business family. Her parents were successful, established, and financially secure. According to him, Lucas wanted to prove he could offer stability before proposing. I listened quietly. Then I asked the obvious question. Why doesn't Lucas buy something himself? The silence lasted a little too long. Finally, Dad sighed. "You know his situation." I did. The failed business, the lost job, the lack of savings. None of it suggested financial stability. "So what are you asking me to do?" He answered quickly. "Help him buy a place." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded ridiculous. Absolutely not. "Claire." "No." I stood and walked toward the window. "That's not helping with rent. That's buying property." "It would be an investment." "There it is." "What?" "The word investment." Dad didn't respond. Whenever my family wanted something expensive, it somehow became an investment. Over the next few weeks, the conversations continued. Dad called, Lucas called, then Dad called again. Nobody demanded anything. That almost made it harder. They just kept giving reasons. "It's temporary." "Property values are strong." "It protects your money." "Lucas is trying to build a future." My answer stayed the same. No. Then Lucas asked if we could meet. We sat in a restaurant we'd been visiting since we were kids. He looked nervous. Not desperate. Just nervous. "I know Dad's been talking to you." I laughed. "That's one way to put it." He looked down at the table. I told him not to push. "Really?" "Seriously." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I didn't expect. "If you say no, that's it." I studied his face. No sales pitch, no guilt, no pressure, just honesty. "I don't want you feeling obligated." That made the conversation harder, because it would have been easier if he'd acted entitled. Instead, he looked embarrassed. A few minutes later, he added quietly, "I know I've needed help more than I should." I didn't argue, mostly because he wasn't wrong. I want things to be different. I looked at him. Different how? A small smile appeared. "I want a real life." For the first time, I believed him, not because of the words, because of the way he said them. The excuses were gone. He sounded like someone trying to grow up. A few days later, I met Victoria for coffee. The property came up naturally. Her reaction surprised me. She looked uncomfortable. Genuinely uncomfortable. "You don't have to do this, Claire." I blinked. What? You really don't. I expected gratitude. Instead, she looked embarrassed. I told Lucas we shouldn't ask. That wasn't what I'd expected. She stirred her coffee for a second before continuing. I don't want our relationship starting with everyone depending on you. That sentence stayed with me, because it sounded responsible. Exactly what I'd come to expect from Victoria. When we left, she thanked me for meeting her. The conversation felt genuine, not staged, not rehearsed. For the first time, I started wondering if maybe everyone was telling the truth. Maybe this wasn't another rescue mission. Maybe it really was an opportunity. A way to help Lucas build something permanent. Over the following weeks, I stopped rejecting the idea automatically. I started asking questions, looking at numbers, comparing properties, reviewing neighborhoods. Dad noticed immediately. So you're considering it? I'm considering looking. That answer alone made him sound relieved. A month later, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney. If I was going to do something this big, I wanted professional advice. I explained everything. The proposal, the property, Lucas, Victoria, my family. When I finished, my attorney leaned back in his chair. If you move forward with this, keep every ownership document in your name. I frowned. Why? His expression didn't change. Because family arrangements tend to become complicated once people start believing something belongs to them. My attorney's advice should have made me pause longer than it did. Instead, I left his office feeling reassured. The documents would stay in my name. Everything would be legally protected. Problem solved. At least, that's what I thought. Over the next several weeks, I started looking at properties seriously. Lucas joined me for some viewings. Victoria came to a few as well. Most of the places didn't feel right. Some were too small. Others needed more work than they were worth. Then we walked into the penthouse. The moment we stepped inside, Lucas stopped talking. That alone was unusual. The place overlooked downtown and had floor-to-ceiling windows along one side of the living room. Victoria slowly walked toward the view. Oh, wow. That was all she said. But it was enough. I remember looking at both of them and thinking the same thing. They could build a life here. A few weeks later, I bought it. Cash. No financing, no complicated arrangements, just a straightforward purchase. The closing process moved quickly, and every document listed exactly one owner. Me. My attorney reviewed everything one final time. Then the keys were handed over. When I gave them to Lucas, he stared at them for a second. You actually did it. I smiled. You sound surprised. I kind of am. For a moment, his eyes looked glassy. Then he hugged me. A real hug. Not the quick, awkward kind siblings usually exchange. Thank you, he said quietly. It had been a long time since I'd heard that much sincerity in his voice. The move itself turned into a family event. Dad showed up early. A couple of cousins helped carry boxes. Victoria spent most of the day organizing rooms before anything was fully unpacked. The atmosphere felt surprisingly normal. Happy, even. At one point, Dad stood in the middle of the living room and shook his head. I can't believe this. What? I asked. He laughed. Feels like things are finally coming together. For the first time in years, I found myself agreeing. A week later, Victoria invited me over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just the three of us. Toward the end of the evening, she handed me a small gift bag. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Inside was a framed photo taken during move-in day. Everyone was smiling, even Dad. A handwritten note was tucked behind the picture. Thank you for believing in us. I won't pretend that note didn't affect me, because it did. It felt personal, thoughtful, real. As the months passed, life settled into a comfortable routine. Lucas eventually found work again, a decent position with a growing company. Victoria continued advancing in her own career. Whenever I visited the penthouse, it actually felt like a home, not a temporary arrangement. A home. The funny thing was that nobody ever talked about ownership. Not Lucas, not Victoria, not Dad. The subject simply never came up. And honestly, I liked it that way. The fewer financial conversations we had, the healthier the relationship seemed. Family gatherings also felt different. Lighter, less tense. People weren't calling me only when they needed help anymore. At least, that's how it seemed. One Sunday evening, we gathered at my aunt's house for dinner. Nothing unusual, just relatives catching up. Halfway through the meal, one of my older cousins turned toward Lucas. "I heard about the penthouse." Lucas smiled politely. "Yeah." My cousin lifted his glass. "Congratulations, man. That's a huge accomplishment." Several people nodded. A few offered similar comments. "Beautiful place. You've done really well for yourself. That's an incredible property." I waited for Lucas to correct them. Or Dad. Or anyone. The conversation continued. More compliments followed. Lucas kept smiling. Dad looked pleased. And not a single person said the penthouse belonged to me. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People made assumptions all the time. My cousin had probably just misunderstood. Lucas lived in the penthouse. Of course, people associated it with him. That explanation worked for about 2 weeks. Then the comments started happening everywhere. A family barbecue, a birthday dinner, a random conversation after church. Every time someone congratulated Lucas on the place, and every time nobody corrected them. At first, I waited. Surely Lucas would say something. Or Dad. Or even Victoria. Instead, the conversation always moved on, like the misunderstanding wasn't worth addressing. One Saturday afternoon, I was scrolling through social media during a break between meetings when Victoria posted a video. It was one of those casual home tour clips. Nothing unusual. She showed the kitchen, the view, the living room, a few decorations they'd recently added. I wasn't even paying much attention until I read the comments. "Lucas worked hard for this. Beautiful home, congratulations. Proud of everything you've built together." Victoria responded with heart emojis, thank you messages, smiling replies. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Not because she had claimed ownership directly. She hadn't. But she wasn't correcting anyone either. That bothered me more than I expected. I eventually closed the app and went back to work. Still, the feeling lingered. A few weeks later, Dad invited me to lunch. Things started normally. Work, family, holiday plans. Then one of his friends joined us unexpectedly. The man shook Lucas's hand and smiled. "Your son has done very well for himself." Dad smiled back. "He certainly has." I looked up. The comment hung in the air. Nobody clarified anything. Nobody mentioned me. The conversation continued. I sat there quietly, stirring my coffee. For the first time, the pattern felt intentional. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just consistent. The strange thing was that Lucas never acted differently toward me. He still called, still invited me over, still thanked me when I helped with small things. That made everything harder to understand. If someone was trying to erase me from the story, why was he still acting like my brother when we were alone? One evening, he invited me to watch a game at the Penthouse. It felt normal, comfortable. For a while, I almost convinced myself I was imagining the whole thing. Then another awkward moment happened. One of his coworkers had come by. We were standing near the kitchen when the coworker looked around and said, "Man, buying a place like this before 40 is impressive." Lucas laughed. "Yeah, it's been a journey." That was it. No correction, no explanation, just enough of an answer to let the assumption stand. I glanced at him. For a second, I thought he might add something. He didn't. The conversation moved on. Driving home that night, I replayed the moment several times. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. A few days later, Victoria invited me over for dinner. I almost declined. Then, I decided against it. I didn't want suspicion turning into resentment without giving people the benefit of the doubt. The evening itself was pleasant. Victoria cooked. Lucas opened a bottle of wine. We talked about work, movies, and vacation plans. Everything felt normal. Until I excused myself to use the restroom. Walking down the hallway, I noticed something strange. The framed photos were different. I slowed down. Months earlier, there had been several pictures from move-in day. Family gatherings, holiday dinners. A few included me. Now most of those were gone. At first, I thought I was remembering wrong. Then I reached the living room again and looked around more carefully. The shelves had changed too. Different photos, different arrangements. I casually walked toward one of the frames. Lucas and Victoria. Dad. More photos of Lucas. Vacation pictures, engagement-style portraits. I kept looking. The realization settled in slowly. Not a single photo of me was visible anywhere in the penthouse, and I knew for a fact there used to be several. I didn't say anything about the missing photos that night, not because I wasn't bothered. I was. But I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. People redecorated. Pictures got moved around. Maybe I was reading too much into it. For a few days, I tried to let it go. Then, another conversation made that impossible. I was attending a charity fundraiser when an older couple approached me. They knew my father. We exchanged the usual small talk before the husband smiled and said, "Your brother has done remarkably well." I already knew where this was going. "The penthouse is beautiful." His wife nodded. "We heard he bought it outright." I forced a polite smile. "That's not exactly what happened." They looked confused. Before I could explain further, someone called them away. The conversation ended, but the feeling didn't. Because that wasn't a random assumption anymore. It was becoming the accepted version of the story. A few days later, I decided to address it directly. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple conversation. Lucas and I met for coffee after work. The timing felt right. So I brought it up. "A lot of people seem to think you bought the penthouse yourself." He looked up from his drink. "So?" I blinked. "So?" "People make assumptions." His tone was casual, almost dismissive. I studied his face. "Why don't you correct them?" He shrugged. "Because it doesn't really matter." The answer irritated me more than I expected. It matters if the story isn't true. Lucas leaned back. "Claire, you're making this bigger than it is." "I'm not making it bigger. I'm asking a question." For the first time, I noticed a hint of defensiveness. Not anger, just irritation. "We both know how everything works." That response didn't answer anything, and somehow that bothered me even more. The conversation drifted to other topics, but something felt different afterward. A little less comfortable, a little less honest. A week later, I found myself discussing the same issue with Victoria. Unlike Lucas, she didn't dismiss it. In fact, she looked uncomfortable almost immediately. We were sitting in her kitchen when I casually mentioned some of the comments people had been making. Her smile faded. "Oh." That was it. Just one word. "Oh?" She looked down at her coffee. "I didn't realize people were saying things like that." The response caught my attention. "You didn't?" She shook her head. "Not really." Something about her reaction felt genuine, not rehearsed, not defensive, just awkward. Then she quickly changed the subject. Fast enough that I noticed, slow enough that it felt intentional. The entire conversation left me with a strange feeling. Not because of what she said, because of what she didn't say. For the first time, I started wondering whether Victoria actually knew how many people believed Lucas owned the penthouse, or whether she'd simply been hearing a different version of events. That question stayed with me. Unfortunately, Dad wasn't interested in discussing any of it. When I brought it up during a phone call, he sounded annoyed almost immediately. "Claire, why are we still talking about this?" "Because people think Lucas bought the property." "So what?" I stared at my office wall. "So what?" "It's not hurting anyone." I laughed in disbelief. "That's not the point." Dad sighed heavily. "You're focusing on the wrong thing." "No. I'm focusing on the truth." His voice hardened. Only slightly, but enough. "Not everything needs to be corrected." The conversation went downhill from there. By the time we hung up, neither of us sounded happy. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Dad and I had disagreed before. But this felt different, like he wasn't trying to understand my perspective at all. As the weeks passed, I stopped bringing up the issue, mostly because every conversation seemed to end the same way. Lucas got defensive. Dad got frustrated. Victoria got uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the story kept spreading. Then one afternoon, my cousin Emily called. We talked about work for a few minutes before she suddenly asked, "So what are you wearing to the engagement party?" I frowned. "The what?" There was a pause. "Lucas and Victoria's engagement party." My stomach tightened. What engagement party? Now it was Emily's turn to sound confused. "The one next month." I sat up straighter. "Emily, I haven't received an invitation." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then she said something that made my chest go cold. "Wait, you're not on the guest list?" Emily sounded more shocked than I was, at least at first. I sat at my desk trying to process what she'd just said. Maybe the invitation got lost. The excuse sounded weak even to me. Emily didn't answer immediately. "Claire, invitations were sent weeks ago." I swallowed. Oh. There wasn't much else to say. We ended the call a few minutes later, but I couldn't focus on work afterward. For years, I'd defended my family. I'd explained away things that hurt. I'd convinced myself there was always a reasonable explanation. This time, I wasn't sure. Still, I wanted answers before jumping to conclusions. So I called Dad. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Claire." Emily mentioned the engagement party. A brief pause. Then, "Right." The way he said it immediately put me on edge. "I haven't received an invitation." Another pause. This one lasted longer. Finally, he said, "We decided to keep it intimate." I stared at the phone. Intimate? Smaller. Family and close friends. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the explanation made no sense. "I am family." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Dad sighed. The same tired sigh he'd been using every time I questioned something lately. "Claire, please don't turn this into an issue." The conversation went nowhere after that. He repeated variations of the same explanation. Small gathering, limited space, nothing personal. By the time we hung up, I felt worse than before. Not because of what he'd said, because none of it sounded true. Over the following week, little pieces of information started finding their way to me, completely by accident. A cousin mentioned hotel reservations. An aunt talked about seating arrangements. Someone else asked whether I was helping with decorations. Every conversation revealed something new. The party wasn't small. Not even close. One evening, Emily called again. "You know they're expecting around 90 guests, right?" I almost dropped my phone. 90? Maybe more. So much for intimate. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat in silence for several minutes. 90 guests, co-workers, family friends, extended relatives, neighbors, business contacts. Apparently there was room for all of them. Just not for me. The strange part was that nobody seemed concerned about my absence. People assumed I had chosen not to attend. One relative even texted me, "I respect your decision to skip the party." I stared at the message. What decision? Nobody had invited me, yet somehow I had become the person refusing to participate. The narrative was already forming without me, just like it had with the penthouse. That realization stayed with me. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing other things. Whenever family members talked about the penthouse now, my name rarely came up. It wasn't deliberate enough to be obvious. Just small omissions, tiny edits, Lucas and Victoria's home, Lucas's place, Lucas's engagement party, Lucas's future. Piece by piece, my role seemed to be disappearing. One Sunday afternoon, I attended a family gathering I'd almost skipped. Several relatives were discussing the engagement plans. I stood nearby listening. Not one person mentioned that I'd purchased the penthouse. Not one. Eventually, someone asked where I was planning to sit during the celebration. The table went quiet. A cousin quickly changed the subject. Nobody looked directly at me. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Driving home afterward, I stopped making excuses. For the first time, I stopped defending them. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because there was nothing left to defend. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was leaving a client meeting. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in months. Mark, an old friend who worked at a local notary office. I answered. "Hey, stranger." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Claire, do you have a minute?" "Sure." There was a pause, long enough to make me stop walking. Then he said, "I wasn't sure whether to call you, but I think there's something you need to know about that penthouse." I stopped walking. The parking lot around me suddenly faded into the background. "What do you mean?" Mark lowered his voice. "I need to be careful about how I say this." That immediately made my stomach tighten. Mark had worked in a notary office for years. He wasn't the type to call people with gossip. If he was calling, there was a reason. "I recently overheard a conversation involving your brother." I leaned against my car. "Okay." There were questions about property ownership. My grip tightened around my phone. "What kind of questions?" Another pause. "Questions about transferring ownership. Questions about whether long-term occupancy could help support a claim. Questions about proving a property had been intended as a gift." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood him. A gift? That's the word I heard. I stared across the parking lot. Nobody was speaking. Nobody was moving. But my heart was suddenly pounding. Mark continued carefully. "I'm not saying anyone has done anything illegal. You're saying they were asking." "Yes." The conversation ended a few minutes later. Mark apologized for involving himself. I thanked him for calling. Then I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine. The missing photos, the stories about Lucas owning the penthouse, the engagement party, the guest list, the silence whenever people made false assumptions. For the first time, all those moments stopped feeling unrelated. They started looking like pieces of the same picture. I hated that thought. I wanted another explanation, a better one. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I called my attorney. 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in his office. He reviewed every document connected to the penthouse: purchase records, transfer confirmations, ownership filings, everything. When he finally closed the folder, his expression remained calm. "Legally, you're fine." I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Completely?" "Completely." That should have made me feel better. Instead, I felt tired. "Could anyone successfully claim the property was a gift?" He shook his head immediately. "Not based on what I'm seeing." I nodded. At least there was that. Then he folded his hands together. "But?" I looked up. There was always a but. If people are actively discussing ownership claims, I wouldn't ignore it. What are you suggesting? His answer came quickly. Protect your interests before the situation becomes more complicated. I knew what he meant. I just wasn't ready to hear it. For years, I'd been solving problems for my family, paying debts, covering emergencies, giving second chances, then third chances, then fourth chances. Every time I told myself things would improve, every time I convinced myself they appreciated it. Now I wasn't sure what they appreciated. The help? Or simply having access to it? A few days later, Lucas called. The conversation was completely normal. Work, sports, weekend plans. At one point, he laughed about something Victoria had said. I laughed too, and somehow that made everything worse, because he sounded exactly like the brother I'd spent years protecting. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about what Mark had told me. When we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, waiting for the guilt to disappear. It didn't. Neither did the anger. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking what would make everyone else happy. Instead, I asked a different question. What would protect me? The answer wasn't complicated. It was just difficult. I called my attorney again. Then I called a real estate agent. The market was strong. Demand was high. Within days, serious buyers started scheduling viewings. I didn't tell Dad. I didn't tell Lucas. I didn't tell Victoria. For once, I kept the decision entirely to myself. The first offer arrived sooner than expected. Then a second. Then a third. I reviewed the paperwork late one evening at my kitchen table. The numbers barely registered. This wasn't really about money anymore. It was about drawing a line. The next morning, I signed the documents authorizing the sale process to move forward. As the papers slid across the desk, my attorney looked at me and asked one final question. Are you sure? I picked up the pen and signed my name. The buyers appeared faster than anyone expected. Within a few weeks, the sale was finalized. A couple relocating to Colorado made a strong offer, and my attorney handled everything. Lucas and Victoria received official notice as part of the process. The timing landed 2 days before their engagement party. I didn't tell anyone. I was done arguing, done defending myself, done trying to convince people to acknowledge the truth. The afternoon of the party, family photos started appearing in group chats. The penthouse was full. Relatives, friends, people from Victoria's side of the family. Then Emily called. The moment I answered, I could hear music and conversations behind her. Claire, something just happened. My stomach tightened. What happened? A legal officer showed up. I sat up immediately. What? He handed Lucas some papers, and he doesn't look good. A few hours later, Emily called back with the full story. Guests had already arrived when the officer asked for Lucas. At first, Lucas looked confused. Then he started reading. According to Emily, the color drained from his face. Victoria noticed immediately. What is it? Lucas didn't answer. She took the paperwork from him and started reading herself. The room gradually became quieter. People could tell something was wrong. Then Victoria stopped on one page and stared at it. The ownership records. The owner's name. Mine, Claire Whitmore. Emily said Victoria read it twice before looking at Lucas. Why is Claire's name on these documents? Nobody answered. Not Lucas. Not my father. Nobody. The questions started almost immediately. Who bought the penthouse? Why had everyone been told Lucas owned it? Why wasn't Claire at the engagement party? Relatives began comparing stories. Members of Victoria's family wanted explanations. The more questions people asked, the worse things became. My attorney later provided copies of the purchase records when they were requested. The documents showed exactly what had happened. I had purchased the penthouse. I had remained the legal owner. Everything pointed back to me. There was no room left for excuses. Emily called me one final time that night. The party was basically over. Guests were leaving early. Victoria and Lucas were arguing privately. My father was trying to explain things. Then Emily repeated the question that had apparently silenced the room. Victoria looked directly at Lucas and asked, "If Claire owns the penthouse, why has everyone been telling me it was yours?" Nobody had an answer, not one that sounded reasonable. Over the next few months, some relatives apologized, others avoided me completely. Lucas called several times, but I wasn't ready to talk. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't seeking revenge. Mostly, I felt relieved. For years, I kept giving more because I thought eventually I'd be appreciated. Instead, I became someone people expected to keep giving. The penthouse wasn't what I lost. What I lost was the need for their approval. And honestly, that was worth more. Sometimes the people who benefit most from your sacrifices are the same people who stop noticing them. Respecting yourself doesn't always mean winning an argument. Sometimes it means deciding you're done carrying a burden that was never yours alone. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been taken for granted by someone you helped? I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening, and wherever you're watching from, take care. I'll see you in the next story.